Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and a local organisation called MPhil Climate Action Forum. And in both organisations, we've been interested in democracy, how you can influence decision makers about specific issues. Now, one of the problems we've got today is democracy is dysfunctional. And when you take it on a global scale, where lots of decisions are made, climate change, poverty, migration, and so on, and many, many more, how you get democratic decision-making into that becomes a real issue and a real problem. Today, we've got John Vlaso with us, who is the UK chair, I think, of the chapter of Democracy Without Borders. And so he's thought about these problems a great deal. So, John, thank you for joining us today. And maybe I could start by asking you, as I usually do, if you could very, very briefly tell us a bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So very, very briefly, I have worked in the military and I've worked in finance, so a slightly different background from a lot of my colleagues currently. And a few years ago, I just asked myself, I was wondering what to do next with my life and asked myself what I really cared about. And I decided that was humanity taking better care of the planet. So that's what brings me here.
You said you were a soldier. You said that you were in finance, but I also gather you were a rock climber as well. And with all those things together, it's a big step to become a campaigner on global democracy, isn't it? How did that happen?
I think I joined the army for some adventures, and I still have adventures rock climbing. And I worked in finance because I decided it would be nice to have a little more money than I had when I was a rock climber. And so those were all sort of things looking after myself. And now I just feel like it's time to give back. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I mean, I could go off now rock climbing and traveling as I used to as a youth, but it feels a bit pointless now. I'm middle-aged and a bit broken, and I would rather now try and leave the planet in better condition for my children.
Well, you're making a difference now in Democracy Without Borders and also in the World Federalist movement, but it's a strange notion, isn't it? Democracy without borders. What does that mean in your mind?
Yeah, I should say that I am indeed the chair of the UK chapter of Democracy Without Borders. I am also the chair of the World Federalist movement globally, so I have a couple of roles in this space. In terms of what Democracy Without Borders means, I personally wouldn't take it literally. It is a without borders bit of marketing material. In fact, I did at one point work with someone from Doctors Without Borders who'd spent some of her working life trying to stop people using without borders in their name. So, if you look at any federal democratic structure, there are borders of more local levels of government within that. But the concept is that this is global. This is beyond the national. This is global democracy.
It's global democracy, but I remember in my student days reading Aristotle, and he said that democracy doesn't really work when you have more than a group, an entity of 5,000 people. So sort of translating that even to a nation state, let alone a global level, has some logistic problems, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is why we move from direct democracy in Greek city-states to representative democracy that we have today. And as Churchill is well known to have said, democracy is the worst form of government we have, apart from all the other forms we have tried from time to time. So the point here really isn't that democracy is the answer and we must apply it to whatever problem comes to hand. The question is, how do we best govern the planet at the global level? And if I may quote the great authority Wikipedia here, world federalism is a realistic extension of the proven concepts of rule and law and liberal democracy to the global level. So that's where we're at.
When you say a federalist solution, a federation of what? Nation states, of regions, of localities? Because if democracy is best seen at a local level, some people have argued cities should get together in some sort of federation, that smaller units should get together. And I guess that you have a view, don't you, that direct democracy or democracy at a local level is a part of the framework of global democracy, because without that, any global democracy wouldn't work.
Absolutely. So, I mean, federal just means different levels of governance. So one can't have a world federal democracy without all the elements being democratic. If you have an autocratic nation in the middle of that, who's responsible for looking after the welfare of the minorities of the population within that autocracy, for example? So ultimately, democratic world federation implies democracy at every level globally, which isn't at all to deny that in the short term, we need to get on with taking action on the environmental challenges we face in the world as it is.
I mean, if you have democracy at a federal level, I'm still not sure how that federal level builds up, what the base unit of the federation is, if it's a nation state or something else. Because every time you have a federation, you must go up step by steps. You can't go from local democracy straight up to world government. You have to have intermediate steps. Now, each step you go, the individual citizens' power and influence seems to get less. And that's the dilemma you face, isn't it?
It is. I mean, one can't wish that away. If you have a global democracy of 8 billion people, each individual amongst the 8 billion isn't having a terribly huge influence on decisions that are made democratically at the global level. So, I mean, faced with that challenge, you could say, oh, it's all too remote from the individual. We better give up on this. Let's not even try and have global governance at all. Let's just set fire to the planet and never mind the pollution and the carbon emissions. That's obviously not a sensible approach for humanity to take. The situation we're in is we face very significant environmental challenges at the global level. We do not currently have effective governance to tackle them. And what is one to do in that situation? And it seems to me the most plausible solution we have is to apply what's worked at the national level and take the best of that to the global level.
But it's getting the people to accept that that's a necessity, isn't it? And is one way of doing that to try and encourage people to understand that they're global citizens as well as national or local citizens, and that global citizenship has a meaning to it?
Absolutely. Getting people to feel they're all part of one humanity is very much part of it. And one can look at all sorts of indigenous wisdom on that. And it's also the case that, federalism is about putting in place the minimum unity necessary to tackle our global challenges, whilst preserving the maximum of diversity. So there's no desire in creating effective global governance to homogenize people or to destroy national identities. Quite the opposite. It frees nations up to build their national identities, to build themselves, to be themselves. But alongside that, we have these global challenges that require effective governance to tackle. And we have to build the unity necessary to do that. And that does mean people seeing themselves as part of global humanity. And of course, in a climate transition, there's the talk of a just transition. I mean, we have a history here, and we have wealthy countries that have pumped the carbon out and poor countries that are just disappearing under the water. And none of us can afford to ignore that. And the problem we face at the moment is we don't have a parliamentary chamber in which to have this discussion in a civilized way at the global level. We've set up global governance as a competition between competing sovereign nation states, and you get lowest common denominator compromise solutions out of that. What we need is somewhere to have constructive deliberation amongst representatives of the people.
Do you think in advocating that, to some extent, you're having an uphill struggle, because I remember when I was young and idealistic about world government and so on, or global government of some kind, you had a sort of listening ear out there to some extent. And in a way, there's a reaction against that now with the growing populist movements that have happened in many, many countries, America here, with the Brexit debate and so on, in Hungary and in Turkey and so on. Do you feel that, in a way, your message is now not getting across as much as you would like, that there are some, in inverted commas, reactionary forces that are making it more difficult for you to achieve what you want?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you look at history since 2000 or thereabouts, one can see that nationalism has been an obstacle to the spread of democracy. But these are, it's a pendulum that swings back and forth. It's not one direction of travel. So we had a lot of globalization after 1989, and since 2000 we've had some reaction against that. And at some point the pendulum swings back, and maybe that's starting now. Maybe what's going on in Ukraine is starting that pendulum swinging back in the other direction. So there's not one direction of travel here. And more importantly than that, to my mind, I mean, I hear a lot. I haven't been doing this for very long, about 5 years maybe, so I'm very new to this world. And I come across people who've been working on UN reform for decades. And if they're still at it, they tend to be rather sort of, they're constrained by realism and what can we actually get done today and so on. And that just seems to me the wrong perspective, because physics doesn't care. I mean, the reality of physics is absolutely going to trump the reality of what's politically achievable. And the planet doesn't care if global politics is a little bit difficult. And if we don't find a way to reduce our carbon emissions, we will keep heating up the planet and we will cause ourselves massive problems. So, yeah, the realism of physics trumps the realism of politics. And either we sort it out or we're going to suffer the consequences.
Well, I was going to ask you whether you thought climate change actually was one of the factors that are making people realize we have to have international solutions, not just national ones. But lots of the sort of evidence comes out is that although people feel strongly that climate change is happening, they even accept that it's created by human activity, they're not so sure about the consequences. Take migration, for example. They don't want people to come in. They feel that their country is being threatened, but they understand that climate change might create mass migrations. So you have these two tensions, and those are huge, aren't they? How do we address those?
Well, the particular example you give doesn't seem to me attention at all. I mean, if people don't want mass migration, they better tackle climate change to avoid it. So, I mean, that's an interesting example. I'm going to give a quote here from Yuval Harari. So something he said was that nationalism has no solution to climate change. If you want to be a nationalist in the 21st century, you have to deny the problem. If you accept the reality of the problem, you must accept that, yes, there's still room in the world for patriotism, still room in the world for having special loyalties and obligations towards your own people, towards your own country. And no one's thinking of abolishing that. But in order to confront climate change, we need additional loyalties and commitments to a level beyond the nation.
But even if we accept that, and you do, and I do as well.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the problems, I've just been reading the autobiography of John Stuart Mill, and he thought that, that to make change, you have to make structural change, but you've got to educate people. They've got to be knowledgeable. But he began to despair about that getting the message over for the action he thought was necessary was more difficult than he thought. Now, you're saying climate change is making people aware. What I think I was saying is, are they aware enough? I mean, do we understand the global implications and the need for global solutions? And have we got time to create that awareness?
I doubt that's a question anybody in the world can answer. How things are actually going to evolve going forwards is deeply unpredictable. I can see a couple of possibilities, which I think are both possible. The first is that humanity as a whole wakes up in time to the seriousness of the challenges we face and creates the governance necessary to tackle. And that seems to be perfectly plausible. I mean, we have functioning federal democracies around the world. And so it's just taking what works at the national level and growing it to the global level, which is a much smaller step than it was going from a tribe of 100 people up to a nation of over 1 billion people. So, we've done most of the work. There's one small step to go. So it seems perfectly plausible we can do that. And the model is one that works already. It's not idealistic, it's not blue sky, it's possible. I also think it's possible that the human species evolved to operate in tribes of 100 people. It didn't evolve in order to be able to manage a population of 8 billion in a planetary environment. And it seems to me it is possible that we will pass some tipping point, that the climate, for example, might move in strongly in a warming direction, causing such migration that the Third World War starts and nuclear weapons get thrown, and we put ourselves back into the Middle Ages or the Stone Age. I mean, that doesn't seem to me impossible at all. And because both possibilities are there, that's what makes it worth advocating. If I was confident it was all going to work out all right in the end, or if I was confident it was going to end in disaster, I wouldn't be here talking to you and advocating. I'd be doing something different.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but sometimes one gets the feeling of frustration that we aren't getting people on board fast enough, though I think there probably are some of the changes that you said. But, after the Second World War, I mean, people then said, we can't go on like we did before with nation states and the way they happened before the First and the Second World Wars. So the United Nations was formed as a sort of kind of world governance, not government. Have you lost faith in the United Nations as a way of doing things?
Well, I mean, I work with great authorities on the United Nations and its history, and I'm certainly not one of them. But my understanding is that after the Second World War, the winners of the Second World War inserted into the United Nations that they would have a veto, so that the United Nations would be established as not to be able to hold the winners of the Second World War to account. And it's been spectacularly successful at failing to hold the winners of the Second World War to account, as we see in Ukraine at the moment. And at the time this was put in place, there were all sorts of people saying this is a disaster. This is not the global governance we need in order to avoid the scourge of war going forwards. So it was absolutely flawed in its foundation, and people said so very loudly at the time. And that's okay if you're not having a nuclear war or an environmental crisis. But once you have a real problem to tackle, which we absolutely do now, you have to have governance that's effective. And effective means enforcement. And enforcement, to be legitimate, requires accountability. And again, you end up back at some sort of parliamentary body.
But, if you have a parliamentary body, well, I mean, you could make decisions between the elites of different countries, as happens in many of the international organizations. But if you're going to have an accountable body, and say the United Nations became one, how do you get over the problem that China would have one vote and a country with only 50,000 people would have one vote as well? That becomes problematic as the problem you mentioned about the Security Council, doesn't it?
Yes, so I won't read this quote. I have it somewhere by a Philippine politician, Carlos Romulo, I think he was called, saying he would much rather have a vote that represented the Philippines' real place in the world in a body that was actually empowered to govern than he would have the fiction of one nation, one vote in a body that was therefore necessarily going to be ineffective, which is where we are today. So if you look at the United States, and perhaps the United States is not the exemplar of democracy it perhaps was a while ago, but nonetheless, so if you look at the structure of democracy in the United States, you have a Senate that's essentially one state, one vote, and a House of Representatives that is one person, one vote. So you have this balance between the state voice and the voice of the people. And that is what I would envisage would happen at the global level as well. So you'd have a General Assembly, which is one state, one vote, as it is at the moment, and then a Parliamentary Assembly that ultimately would be one person, one vote, but would start, like the European Parliament, with digressive proportionality. So somewhere midway between one state, one vote, and one person, one vote.
I mean, that's how the founding fathers wanted the American Constitution to work. But we've discovered recently and sometimes in the past that hasn't worked as well as people would like. And if you translated that or transferred that to the global level, you'd be in a situation where you had like Congress in the United States, where people are proportionally there. And if China and India got together, they would have so many votes that other countries would be overwhelmed. That's going to be an impediment, isn't it, for anyone agreeing to a global government of that kind?
I think there's a question of timescale here as well. So, I mean, if initially one starts off with an advisory body rather than a legislative body, that addresses one challenge there. And if one starts with digressive proportionality, with votes in proportion to the square root of the population, for which there is a mathematical justification, then that diminishes the relative voice of the large countries. Ultimately, I've heard people say you can't have one person, one vote because China's got a lot of people. Well, ultimately, I think a Chinese person's exactly worth the same as myself. And so ultimately, I can see no justification for anything other than one person, one vote. But ultimately, as in the United States, I think nations would be more like states in the US. They wouldn't be the dominant political entity that they are today in the world we have today. So it's a question of timescale.
If we're talking about climate change, we don't have that time scale. And that's the problem, isn't it? That to get people to think as you're thinking takes a long time. And we've got to make decisions fairly quickly. How can we work internationally now when we've got to take decisions, especially on climate change, very quickly?
So that's a project I'm working on right now, which is called the Mega Project, Mobilizing an Earth Governance Alliance. So there are all sorts of steps we can take in the short term, such as creating more accountability around the Paris climate commitments that nations make, increasing the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, the Ecocide campaign, the Vanuatu initiative to get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. There's a whole lot of steps that could be taken, and are work in progress. I mean, these are things that are happening. And so I think we should be proceeding with all of these initiatives, but we should be doing it in a framework that we know where we're headed. And ultimately, the fundamental issue we face today, in my opinion, is that sovereign nations are not held to account. They're the ultimate authority. They compete, and you end up with lowest common denominator solutions that don't serve the common interest of humanity. No one speaks for humanity. Where is the body where the debate happens about what's best for the people of the world? There isn't such a body. Obviously, we need one. Obviously, we need some parliamentary body at the global level. That's a direction of travel. But of course, we cannot put action on climate change on hold until China becomes democratic. So that's a pragmatic matter of taking the short-term steps that we can, but making sure we have the longer-term direction in mind. And we need to be working on that longer-term direction now. Equally, if you look at the fact we're at COP27 already on the environment and climate emissions continue to rise, working in the current framework isn't working for the planet. And so if 30 years ago more emphasis had been put on the longer term solution, we might be in a better place today. So we must be working on both in parallel.
You said in your blog, which is interesting, and maybe that provides or indicates a way forward. You talked about having a world government of issues, or a world assembly of issues, like a world parliament of the rivers. You could have one on food insecurity, on air pollution, and so on. A citizens' assembly, but writ large. Is that a way forward that you think would be possible?
It's possible as an intermediate step, but it's no solution. I mean, no nation is run by a whole group of special interest parliaments. It would be an absolutely insane way to run a parliament. And then where's the body is to run a nation? Sorry, where's the body that would adjudicate between these different special interests? Who adjudicates between money to be spent on biodiversity and climate, between rivers and food and pollution? So ultimately, you need a parliamentary body at the top level where this deliberation occurs, ultimately where legislation occurs, acting in the common interest of all, looking at problems in the round. a citizens' assembly. I mean, it's not a governance body, is it? They don't legislate. They form public opinion. They inform legislatures. They're tools, but they're not governance bodies. So, yes, one could certainly have intermediate steps along these lines. And my view on the fundamental reform of global governance we need is that it's going to take a catalyst. That catalyst is likely to come about in the environmental space. And therefore, let us focus right now on tackling the greatest problem we know we face, which is environmental challenges. Therefore, let's start with environmental governance. Of course, once you start trying to govern the environment, you immediately get caught up in issues of justice and finance and peace and so on.
But you talked about World Parliament of Rivers, etc., has been an intermediate step. But in a way, you have to. I mean, your idea is so sort of big, huge, that you have to do things step by step, unless you have a cataclysmic change that makes people realize that they all have to work together, and then it may be too late. Now you have to work step by step, don't you? So do you have a sort of roadmap in your mind about how we can get from where we are now to where you want to be?
Right. So I'm going to give one more quote, which is Milton Friedman quote, which I'm reciting a lot at the moment. So Milton Friedman said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable."
Well,
so in terms of a roadmap, I don't think it's likely we're going to have the massive reform of global governance we need until there's a massive catalyst for it. And that is obviously not something that one can predict in terms of timing. I mean, what year is the whole of California going to catch fire, or whatever this catalyst may be? But that isn't to say there isn't a roadmap for what we should do now, which is to develop the plans and to keep them alive in policymakers' minds. That's very much the case. And as we've been discussing, there are all sorts of intermediate steps we could take, like the Vanuatu initiative for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. So let us work on all that. But the critical thing, to my mind, I mean, you say it's a massive reform I'm trying to undertake. Yes, because we have a massive problem. This is why I'm here. This is why I'm working on it. Humanity is not taking care of the planet. That could be cataclysmic for humanity. If you read the IPCC reports, if you talk to Johan Rockström, the potential for cataclysm is there. And so there's a massive catalyst, and we need massive reform to tackle it. But it's not so weird what we're trying to do. We're simply taking what works best at the global level in terms of governance and what works best at the national level and taking that to the global level.
So looking forward in the next 5 years, or this decade, which is going to be the most critical one in terms of climate change, certainly, and maybe other areas as well. I mean, how do you see your vision developing over that time?
So a colleague of mine called Maya Groff is putting together a report on climate governance that covers precisely what we've been talking about, what one can do in the short term, what we need to do in the longer term, and how we go about it. And then it's always comparatively easy to come up with what reforms you would like to see. And the challenge is always, how do we implement these reforms? And here we do already see the environmental crises we face creating demand amongst policymakers at the global level for solutions. And so this report of my colleague Maya Groff, being produced for the Climate Governance Commission, is a package of reforms, short-term and long-term, that is a comprehensive solution. It answers the demand from the policymakers. And looking historically at where real changes happened in global governance space, there's a report from the Stimson Center on smart coalitions, which is coalitions of state and non-state actors that have made real change happen. So an example is the Landmines Treaty. Another one is the International Criminal Court, which is a previous project of the World Federalist Movement, which I chair. So you gather together civil society organizations, academics, experts, and then states, and you get this onto the agenda of the General Assembly. and you get real change to happen.
Okay. I mean, that's quite interesting. And the idea of smart coalitions, I think, is a really brilliant one and one way to move. Okay, so we sort of come to the end of our 30 minutes. So if anyone wanted to find out more about what you do in both the organizations, the World Federalist Movement and Democracy Without Borders, or make contact with you, how would they go about it?
Well, they can Google them and I can share the website addresses with you. So there's Democracy Without Borders. There's the World Federalist Movement, and there's the Climate Governance Commission. And I would urge people to look at those websites.
Okay. Okay, well, we'll sort of publish those as well. So thank you for that. Well, thank you for doing this webinar, because, I mean, you were in the forefront of dealing with this really critical problem, is that how in a world that seems to be more dividing in many ways, how can we come together and confront and face the problems that are really important? And the two biggest ones clearly are climate change and nuclear proliferation. And we really have to do something, and you are doing something, and that's important. And the Milton Friedman idea, although we may disagree with Milton Friedman on many things, that that when critical situations occur, that's when we have to change, and building up alternatives until then is really vital. And you are trying to build up an alternative. So thank you for doing the webinar today. It's been great. And we'll end this interview now.
Okay, can I give you a final thought to people take away with them?
Go ahead.
I mean, we can sink into despair at the impossibility of it all and give up and just what happens. Or we can see the hope, because humanity has done tremendously well so far, and we know how to do it, and it's perfectly possible we can do it. It just needs a change, as you say, global citizenship, global mindset. We can do this, and let's do it.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. I mean, that's an important message to have at the end, and I think we all have to think and rethink how we're going to move forward in this coming really critical decade. So thank you. We will end this webinar now.
Thank you, Francis.